The first sound was the shattering of glass, a sharp, crystalline explosion that ripped through the sleepy afternoon hum of redemption. Jack Thorne didn't flinch. He was standing at the teller's counter of the Redemption Bank and Trust, his calloused hands turning a worn leather pouch of coins over and over. He was a man who had learned long ago that flinching only got you killed faster. The second sound was a woman's scream, high and thin, followed by the deep, authoritative boom of a man's voice. Nobody moves a muscle. Jack turned slowly, his body moving with the coiled economy of a predator, long past its prime, but no less dangerous for it. 4 men stood framed in the splintered doorway, their faces obscured by dusty bandanas. 3 held rifles, their barrels glinting in the shafts of sunlight that cut through the dust-filled air. The 4th man, clearly the leader, held 2 silver-plated revolvers, his thumbs resting on the hammers with an unnerving calm. He was taller than the others, his duster clean, his boots polished. There was an air of theatricality about him, a confidence that went beyond mere thuggery. "Gentlemen," and the leader announced, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone that was jarringly out of place. "This is a simple transaction. You will provide us with your assets, and we in turn will provide you with the gift of continued respiration. A fair trade, I think." The townsfolk inside the bank, a rancher, the blacksmith's wife, 2 young clerks, froze like startled deer. The bank manager, a portly man named Henderson, with a perpetually sweating brow, raised his hands, his face the color of spoiled milk. Jack remained still, his eyes cataloging details. The way the men stood fanned out to cover all angles. The professional manner in which they ignored the pittance in the teller's drawers and pointed a rifle directly at Henderson. They weren't amateurs. They knew where the real money was. "The safe, Mr. Henderson," the leader purred, stepping forward. He moved with a dancer's grace, his spurs ringing a soft, predatory chime on the wooden floor. "If you would be so kind." Henderson scrambled to comply, his fingers fumbling with a heavy combination lock. Jack's gaze never left the leader. Something about the man's posture, the confident tilt of his head, stirred a phantom memory, a ghost from a past Jack had spent a decade trying to bury. The safe door swung open with a groan. One of the thugs began stuffing bags with banknotes and gold coin, but the leader, Silas Kane, held up a gloved hand. "Patience, my friend. We are not common thieves. We are collectors." He walked to the open safe and peered inside past the stacks of currency. His eyes landed on a small velvet-lined box on a high shelf. "That," he said, pointing. "Bring me that." Henderson, confused, retrieved the box. It contained items held for collateral, the small, desperate treasures of a town clinging to solvency. Silas took the box and rummaged through it, discarding a gold watch and a set of pearl earrings. His fingers closed around something small and silver. He lifted it into the light. It was a locket, a simple heart-shaped silver locket tarnished with age. Jack's blood ran cold. He felt the air leave his lungs as if he'd been punched in the gut. He knew that locket. He knew the tiny, intricate engraving of a desert rose on its surface. He knew the faulty clasp that had always required a thumbnail to pry open. He had pawned it 6 months ago on the worst night of his life, a night drowned in whiskey and regret, when the weight of his loneliness had become unbearable. Inside that locket was a miniature portrait of his late wife, Sarah. Her smile, the one that had been the sun in his sky, was captured forever in that tiny silver heart. Silas Kane smiled, a slow, cruel curving of his lips, visible above his bandana. He held the locket up for all to see, but his eyes were locked on Jack. It was a look of profound, personal triumph. "A beautiful little trinket," Silas said, his voice dripping with mock sentimentality. "A reminder of things lost." He tucked the locket into his vest pocket, patting it gently. "All right, boys. We have what we came for." As his men backed out of the door, their rifles still trained on the petrified citizens, Silas paused. He looked directly at Jack, and for a fleeting second, he lowered his bandana. His face was young, handsome, but marred by a jagged scar that ran from his temple to his jaw. His eyes, however, were ancient with hatred. "This is just the beginning, Thorn." He whispered the words meant for Jack alone. Then he was gone, swallowed by the dust and chaos outside. The spell broke. The blacksmith's wife began to sob. Henderson collapsed against the wall, hyperventilating. But Jack Thorn did not move. He stared at the empty doorway, the world around him fading to a dull roar. They hadn't just robbed a bank. They had broken into his soul and stolen the last piece of light he had left. The robbery was not a crime against redemption. It was a declaration of war against him. And in the heavy, dust-choked silence of the violated bank, Jack Thorn, the retired gunslinger who had sworn off violence forever, felt the cold, familiar weight of a promise he now had to break. The silence that fell over redemption after the robbery was a heavy blanket thick with unspoken grief and the ghosts of prospectors who had long since turned to dust. The sun beat down on the sun-bleached, clapboard buildings, baking the earth into a cracked, brittle shell. The only sounds were the mournful creak of the gallows frame in the wind and the buzz of flies circling a puddle of spilled whiskey outside the saloon. Redemption wasn't a town. It was a monument to faded hope, a place people ended up, not a place they chose. Jack Thorn's small cabin on the edge of town was a reflection of its owner, Spartan, weathered, and fiercely solitary. He sat at his rough-hewn table, a bottle of cheap rye untouched before him, methodically cleaning his Colt Peacemaker. The rhythmic click-clack of the cylinder turning was the only thing that could quiet the storm in his mind. The image of Silas Kane's sneering face, of his Sarah's locket disappearing into that man's pocket, was seared behind his eyes. He had spent 10 years building a wall of anonymity around himself, trying to outrun the man he used to be. In 10 minutes, Silas Kane had torn it all down. A heavy tread on his porch announced the arrival of Sheriff Miller. The sheriff was a man carved from the same hard granite as the surrounding hills, his face a road map of worry lines, his shoulders permanently stooped under the weight of a town that had more problems than laws. He didn't bother knocking, just pushed the door open and filled the frame. "Jack," he said, his voice raspy with dust and exhaustion. He eyed the meticulously disassembled gun on the table. "Figured I'd find you communing with old friends." Jack didn't look up. They're quiet company. Miller eased himself into the other chair, letting out a weary sigh. They got away clean. Roads south split up in the canyons. Trails colder than a banker's heart. He ran a hand over his balding head. They weren't just after money, Jack. They took Henderson's safe box, but they left valuables behind. And they burned something in the back office. The fire was out before it could spread, but it was deliberate. They torched the county land registry. Deeds, claims, survey maps, all gone. Jack finally looked up, his gray eyes as hard and cold as river stones. "Why tell me?" "Because that leader, the one with the fancy guns, he knew you. He said your name. And Henderson told me what he took from you." Miller leaned forward, his voice dropping. "That locket. It meant something." The words hung in the air, heavy and true. Jack's jaw tightened. He reassembled the Colt with practiced fluid movements, the final click of the hammer echoing in the small room. "It did," was all he said. "I'm short on deputies and long on trouble." Miller said, getting to the point. "I need a tracker. I need a gunslinger. I need the man you used to be just for a little while." Jack stood up and slid the Peacemaker into the worn leather holster on his hip. The fit was as natural as breathing. "Not my fight, Sheriff. It is when they steal from your past." Jack Miller pressed his desperation plain. "It is when they burn down the very records that hold this town together. This isn't just about money anymore. It feels personal." As if on cue, a softer presence graced the doorway. Elena Vance, the town's schoolteacher, stood there, a basket of bread and dried jerky in her hands. Her dress was simple, her hair tied back in a practical bun, but her eyes were sharp with an intelligence that missed nothing. She was the town's unappointed historian, the keeper of its stories, and one of the few people who looked at Jack Thorne and saw not a killer, but a man in pain. She stepped inside her gaze, taking in the tense tableau. "Sheriff," she said with a nod, then turned to Jack. "I heard what happened. I'm sorry, Jack. Truly. Doesn't change anything?" Jack grunted, turning to stare out the grimy window. Elena placed the basket on the table. Her voice was calm and measured a stark contrast to the simmering violence in the room. "Vengeance is a poor substitute for healing, Mr. Thorne." She said, her use of his formal name a gentle reprimand. "But justice can be a start. This town is bleeding. Men like Silas Kane are the wound. You know how to stop the bleeding." Jack's shoulders tensed. He hated it when she was right. He had come to redemption to be forgotten, to let the man known as the Shadow of the Rio Grande die a quiet death. But Silas Kane had called him out by name, had desecrated the memory of his wife. This wasn't about the town. This was about a ghost he had failed to bury. He turned from the window, his face a mask of grim resolve. "I'll track them," he said, his voice a low growl. "But I'm not doing it for the town miller. I'm not doing it for justice." He looked from the sheriff to Elena, his eyes burning with a cold fire she had never seen before. "I'm doing it for the locket." Sheriff Miller nodded, a flicker of relief crossing his tired face. "That's all I'm asking." Elena watched him, her expression a mixture of fear and hope. She saw the old Jack, the dangerous man of legend, stir from his slumber. She knew that in sending him after Silas Kane, they were not just chasing a thief. They were unleashing a force of nature, and she could only pray that when the storm passed, there would be something left of the quiet man she had come to know. The trail began where logic ended, in the labyrinthine canyons south of Redemption, where the earth was a fractured mosaic of rust-red rock and thorny scrub. Jack rode with the sun at his back, his horse a stoic gray gelding named Ghost, picking its way through the treacherous terrain with sure-footed grace. The initial tracks left by Silas Kane's gang were bold, arrogant gouges in the dirt, a clear path for any fool to follow. But after 5 miles, the tracks splintered. The gang had split up, fanning out in a dozen different directions, their trails dissolving on the hard, unforgiving stone of the canyon floor. Amateurs leave a trail. Professionals leave a puzzle. Jack dismounted, running his hand over the ground. Nothing. No scuffed rock, no broken twigs, no fresh horse droppings. It was as if they had vanished into the hot, thin air. Sheriff Miller, who had ridden with him for the first part of the day, swore under his breath. "It's a cold trail, Jack. Colder than a witch's kiss." "They planned this," Jack said, his eyes scanning the towering rock formations around them. They knew this territory. They knew where the ground wouldn't hold a print. His first obstacle wasn't the harsh landscape or the burning sun. It was the chilling competence of his adversary. This wasn't a posse chase. It was a hunt, and for the first time in a long while, Jack felt like the prey. They spent 2 days casting wide circles, searching for any sign, but found nothing. It was a failure, sharp and humbling. They returned to Redemption, empty-handed, the town's fragile hope curdling into fear. Jack refused to accept defeat. If tracking wouldn't work, investigation would have to. He locked himself away, not with his gun, but with his memories, forcing himself to replay every second of the robbery. Silas Kane's voice, his posture, the way he moved. The name he had used, Thorne. It wasn't just a name. It was an accusation. He went back to the bank with Miller. The place was swept clean, but the smell of burnt paper still hung in the air. In the back office, the scorched remains of the land registry cabinet were a black, gaping wound. Why burn the deeds, Miller mused, kicking at a piece of charred debris. If it's a land grab, you need the deeds, not the ashes. Maybe it's not about grabbing what's there. Jack countered, his mind working. Maybe it's about erasing what was. He sifted through the ashes, his fingers finding a few miraculously preserved scraps. Most were illegible, but one corner of a survey map remained, showing the northern valley. On it, a single name was visible, written in the elegant script of the county clerk, Kane. The name meant nothing to him, but it was a thread. He took the scrap to the one person in town who might know what it meant. Elena Vance's schoolhouse was an oasis of order in the chaos of redemption. Books lined the shelves, and the air smelled of chalk dust and dried ink. She was marking papers by the light of a kerosene lamp when Jack entered. She looked up, her expression softening when she saw the weary set of his shoulders. "No luck, I take it," she said gently. "No," Jack admitted, placing the charred map fragment on her desk. "But I found this. The name Kane. Does it mean anything to you?" Elena's brow furrowed. She pushed her papers aside, her historian's instincts taking over. The Kanes were one of the founding families of this valley, along with the Abernathys and the McMasters. They had a huge ranch north of here, prime grazing land. But they're long gone. How long? About 10 years, she said, her eyes distant with thought. There was a feud, a dispute over water rights with another landowner, a man named Josiah Blackwood. It turned bloody. The Kanes were run out. Their ranch was abandoned. People say the place is haunted by what happened there. 10 years. The numbers struck a discordant chord in Jack's memory. 10 years ago, he hadn't been Jack Thorne, the quiet recluse of redemption. He had been a gun for hire, working for men like Josiah Blackwood. "What happened to them?" Jack pressed. "The records are spotty," Elena said, pulling a heavy leather-bound ledger from a shelf, the town's unofficial history compiled by her predecessor. The patriarch, Elias Kane, was killed. His oldest son, Daniel, was killed shortly after in a duel. The mother and the younger son, they just disappeared. Vanished. The official story is they fled the territory. As she spoke, Jack felt a cold dread begin to creep up his spine. He remembered a job for Blackwood. A young man with fire in his eyes, a dispute over a stream, a duel at high noon under a blistering sun. He had been faster. He had always been faster. The memory was hazy, shrouded in a fog of countless jobs and nameless faces, thick with a guilt he had never been able to name. This younger son, Jack, said, his voice barely a whisper. Did he have a name? Elena flipped through the fragile pages of the ledger. It's only mentioned once in a baptismal record. Silas. His name was Silas. The name hit Jack like a physical blow. Silas Kane. The man from the bank. The puzzle pieces began to slam into place, forming a picture of horrifying clarity. The burned deeds weren't random vandalism. They were the methodical erasure of a family's history. The robbery wasn't about money. The theft of the locket wasn't a crime of opportunity. It was a message. This was a ghost from his past, a past he thought he had buried, returned to claim its due. And Jack Thorne was standing squarely on the haunted ground of his own making. The investigation became a grim excavation of the past. Jack and Elena worked in the quiet confines of the schoolhouse, the lantern light casting long dancing shadows on the walls as they pieced together the history of the Kane family. Elena, with her meticulous knowledge of town records, unearthed old newspaper clippings and property filings. Jack, with his eidetic memory for the violent details of his former life, provided the bloody context. A witness from the robbery. A stable hand who'd been outside the bank was finally coaxed by Sheriff Miller into talking. The leader's horse, the boy stammered, it had a brand I'd never seen before. a circle with a C inside like a broken ring. Elena found a corresponding sketch in an old cattleman's registry. It was the brand for the Kane Ranch, the broken circle C. Another piece clicked into place. Silas wasn't just using the name. He was flying the family flag. One evening, Jack took a ride out to one of the gang's abandoned campsites Miller had found. It was picked clean professional as always. But as he scoured the ground, something glinted under a mesquite bush. He picked it up. It was a spent cartridge. He turned it over in his palm, his thumb tracing the markings on its base. A 44-40 Winchester, but custom-loaded. The primer was sealed with a distinct red lacquer. Jack's breath caught in his throat. He knew that ammunition. 10 years ago, Josiah Blackwood had paid top dollar for it ammunition for a new model of rifle he was proud of. And Jack had used that ammunition in a duel against a young man defending his family's land. Daniel Kane. The memory, once a hazy blur, sharpened with agonizing detail. He saw the boy's defiant face, the fierce pride in his eyes. He heard the whisper of the wind just before the draw. He felt the familiar buck of his Colt. He saw the red stain blossom on the young man's white shirt. At the time, he told himself it was just a job. Blackwood had called Daniel Kane a hot-headed thief who was stealing his water. A righteous killing, he told himself. Justice for a paying client. Now that certainty felt like a lie he had built his whole life upon. Each clue they uncovered triggered another one of his fragmented flashbacks, each more vivid and damning than the last. He saw the face of a younger boy watching from the porch of a ranch house, his small face streaked with tears and fury. A boy with his brother's eyes. A boy with a jagged scar just beginning to form on his temple, a scar from a flying piece of shrapnel in an earlier skirmish. Silas. He was beginning to understand. This wasn't just revenge for a brother's death. This was about reclaiming a legacy, about wiping the slate clean by burning the world that had wronged him. Silas was systematically destroying the pillars of the community that had stood by and watched his family fall, the bank that held the false deeds, the registry that legitimized the theft, and finally, the man who had pulled the trigger. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source. Sheriff Miller, frustrated with the dead ends, had put the word out through his network of informants. A message came back from a marshal 2 territories over. A gang matching the description, led by a charismatic man named Kane, had been hitting banks and land offices all along the frontier. They were disciplined, almost military in their precision, and they never stayed in one place for long. The message included a list of known associates. Miller, Jack, and Elena studied the list. One name leaped out, a low-level outlaw named Caleb Weasel Poe, known for his cowardice and his tendency to talk when cornered. The marshal's note indicated Poe had family ties to a small mining camp a day's ride from Redemption. "It's a long shot," Miller said, rubbing his tired eyes. "But it's the only shot we've got." They rode out at dawn. The mining camp was a miserable collection of shacks clinging to a mountainside. They found Weasel Poe in the back of a canvas-walled saloon, nursing a bottle of rot-gut whiskey. When he saw the sheriff's badge, he tried to bolt. Jack moved faster, his arm barring the door like a fallen oak. They took him to the camp's makeshift jail, a small, stiflingly hot shed with a single barred window. Poe was terrified, his bravado melting away under Miller's stern gaze. He denied everything, swearing he hadn't seen Silas Kane in months. Jack watched from the corner, silent. He let Miller ask the questions, letting Poe's lies build on one another until they formed a tangled, desperate web. Finally, Jack stepped forward. He didn't say a word. He just placed the red lacquered cartridge on the table in front of Poe. Poe's eyes widened. He stared at the cartridge as if it were a coiled rattlesnake. "Silas is sentimental," Jack said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of a tombstone. "He holds on to things that remind him of what he's lost." You know what this is, don't you, Caleb? Poe began to tremble. I don't know nothing about no bullets. This bullet was fired 10 years ago. Jack continued, his voice dropping lower, each word a hammer blow. It was part of a set paid for by Josiah Blackwood, and it was used to kill a man named Daniel Kane. Jack leaned in close, his face inches from Poe's. Now you're going to tell me where Silas is, or I'm going to start wondering if maybe you were there 10 years ago too. And I'm going to get sentimental myself. The threat steeped in a history Poe couldn't possibly understand, but whose violence he could feel was enough. The outlaw broke. He started babbling words, tumbling over each other in a desperate bid for self-preservation. He ain't running. Poe cried, sweat beading on his forehead. He's holed up in the old hideout, the Devil's Maw. But you don't get it. This ain't about the money. He doesn't care about the gold. Then what is it about? Miller demanded. Poe looked past the sheriff, his fearful eyes landing on Jack. A sneer twisted his lips, the last vestige of a cornered man's defiance. It's about you, Thorne. It's always been about you. He let out a ragged, humorless laugh. Silas Kane, he's Daniel's little brother, the one you made an orphan. The confession landed with the force of a physical impact. The schoolhouse, the charred map, the cartridge, it all converged into a single, terrible truth. The story Jack had told himself for a decade, the narrative of a righteous killing of a gunslinger, simply doing a dirty job, was a lie. He had been an instrument of destruction, the architect of a boy's grief. Poe's voice dripped with venomous glee as he delivered the final devastating blow. He's not after gold, Thorne. He's here to burn your whole world down, just like you did to his. The world tilted on its axis. The fight was no longer about a stolen locket or burned deeds. It was a reckoning. Silas Kane was a specter of Jack's own, making a living embodiment of his greatest sin, returned to collect a debt that could only be paid in blood and ash. The path forward was no longer a pursuit of justice. It was a pilgrimage toward an absolution Jack knew he would never deserve. The revelation left Jack adrift in a sea of guilt. He saw his life not as a series of choices, but as a chain of destructive consequences leading directly to this moment. The quiet life he had built in redemption was a house of cards. Silas Kane was the righteous wind come to blow it all down. He retreated into himself, of the silence in his cabin growing heavier than ever before. He cleaned his guns, but his hands felt clumsy. He stared at his own reflection in the window and saw the face of a monster. Elena found him there 2 days later, a statue carved from regret. She didn't offer platitudes or easy comfort. She simply sat with him, a quiet presence in his storm, and told him, "The man you were 10 years ago is not the man you are today. You can't change the past, Jack, but you can decide what to do with the present." Her words were a lifeline, but he didn't know how to grasp it. Before he could, the present came for him. It happened at dusk. A boy from town, breathless and wide-eyed, came sprinting to his door. "It's Mr. Kane," he panted. "He's back." He rode right into the town square, bold as brass. Jack and Miller met in the middle of the street. The town was in an uproar. Silas Kane, far from fleeing after Poe's capture, had done the unthinkable. He had returned. He hadn't fired a shot. He had ridden to the center of town, dismounted, and nailed a piece of paper to the notice board outside the sheriff's office before riding out again, unhurried and untouchable. The paper was a single, elegantly written note. Miller tore it from the board and read it aloud, his voice grim. "Thorne, you took my brother. You took my home. Now I have taken your future. She is waiting for you where it all began. Come alone. Come at dawn. Let's finish the story. S.C." Jack's heart stopped. "Your future?" He looked around wildly, his eyes scanning the panicked faces in the crowd. "Elena," he breathed. "Where is Elena?" A frantic search confirmed his worst fears. The schoolhouse was empty. Books were scattered on the floor, a sign of a struggle. A single pressed wildflower, one she had shown him from her collection just days before, lay crushed on the floorboards. Silas had taken her. He had identified the one thing in Jack's desolate world that represented hope, a connection to a life beyond violence, and he had ripped it away. The message was clear. The final showdown would not be in the streets of redemption. It would be at the old abandoned Kane Ranch, the physical embodiment of Jack's sins, the very ground where the Kane family's ruin had begun. Silas wasn't just forcing a fight. He was staging a play with the ghosts of the past as the audience. "It's a trap," Jack Miller warned, his hand on Jack's arm. "He wants you on his ground, on his terms. We can gather a posse, wait him out." Jack shook his head, and his eyes fixed on the northern horizon where the skeletal remains of the Kane Ranch lay silhouetted against the dying sun. He said, "Come alone. If a posse rides with me, he'll kill her." His voice was unnervingly calm, the chaotic emotions of the past few days forged into a single sharp point of purpose. "This isn't the town's fight anymore. It never was. It's mine." He spent the night preparing. He cleaned his Colt Peacemaker and his Winchester rifle until they gleamed. He filled his pockets with cartridges, not with the red lacquered rounds of his past, but with standard lead-nosed bullets. He was no longer a hired gun. He was a man on a desperate mission. As the first hint of gray light touched the eastern sky, he saddled Ghost. Miller was there to see him off, his face etched with worry. "Be careful, Jack. Don't let his hate make you become something you're not." Jack swung into the saddle. He looked at the weary sheriff, a good man trapped in a bad world. "The thing is, Miller," he said, his voice raw with a truth he was only just beginning to accept, "I think I already am." He turned his horse north and rode toward the dawn, toward the decaying ranch that held his past, his future, and his final terrible reckoning. The wind began as a whisper, a mournful sigh that rustled the dry grass on the plains. By the time the skeletal silhouette of the Kane Ranch appeared on the horizon, the whisper had grown into a howl. A dust storm was coming. The sky to the west was a bruised, roiling wall of brown, swallowing the landscape, churning the world into a gritty twilight. It was as if the heavens themselves were raging against the sins buried in this land. The ranch was a skeleton picked clean by time and neglect. The main house sagged its porch, collapsing its windows like vacant eyes. The barn had caved in on one side, and the corral fence was a line of broken teeth. Jack dismounted at the edge of the property, the wind tearing at his duster, stinging his eyes with sand. The air was thick, visibility dropping with every gust. The storm wasn't just an obstacle. It was an active threat, a third combatant in the duel to come. He saw a single lantern burning in one of the downstairs windows of the house, a beacon in the swirling chaos. He moved forward, his Winchester held at the ready, his boots crunching on the gravel path his own footsteps had helped pave a decade ago. The front door creaked open on its own, beckoned by the wind. Inside the house was a tomb of dust and decay. Furniture lay draped in white sheets like corpses. In the center of the main room, Elena was tied to a chair. She was unhurt, but her eyes were wide with fear. Standing behind her, one hand resting on her shoulder, was Silas Kane. He was dressed impeccably, his duster unbuttoned to reveal a clean shirt and vest. The silver locket. Sarah's locket was pinned to his lapel like a medal. "Welcome home, Thorne." Silas said, his voice cutting through the scream of the wind. "Or should I say, welcome back to the scene of the crime." "Let her go, Kane." Jack said, his voice a low growl. "This is between you and me." "Oh, everything is between you and me," Silas said with a chilling smile. "She is merely the final act, a demonstration. You see, you didn't just kill my brother. You erased my family. You turned our name to dust. So I thought it was only fitting that I take the one thing that could give your name a future." The house groaned around them as a powerful gust of wind hammered against the walls, shaking the very foundations. Sand streamed through cracks in the walls, coating everything in a fine brown powder. "I was a gun for hire," Jack said, taking a slow step forward. "I was paid to do a job. It was nothing personal." Silas laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "Nothing personal? You call this nothing personal?" He gestured around the decaying room. "This was my home. My father built this house with his own 2 hands. My brother Daniel, he died on that porch defending it." Silas's face contorted, the charismatic mask slipping to reveal the raw agony beneath. "But here is the part of the story you never bothered to learn, the part that wasn't in your contract." He took a step away from Elena, his eyes burning with a feverish intensity. This was the secondary twist, the final poisoned arrow in his quiver. "My brother wasn't a thief. He was a hero. The man who hired you, Josiah Blackwood, was a corrupt land baron. He was using his wealth and influence to systematically squeeze every small rancher out of this valley. He dammed the creek upstream, choking our water supply, trying to force us to sell for pennies on the dollar. Daniel found proof. He had letters, documents proving Blackwood was bribing federal surveyors and judges. He was going to expose him to save this entire valley." The word struck Jack with the force of a physical blow. He remembered Blackwood's easy charm, the casual way he dismissed Daniel Kane as a nuisance. Jack hadn't been an instrument of justice. He had been a pawn, a well-paid assassin hired to silence a man who was trying to do the right thing. The righteous killing was a lie. He was a murderer, plain and simple. "Blackwood told you Daniel was stealing his water." Silas spat, his voice thick with contempt. "He paid you to murder a good man so he could continue his conquest. You weren't a peacekeeper, Thorne. You were the punctuation mark at the end of his greedy sentence." The truth was a bitter pill dissolving the last of Jack's self-deceptions. He lowered the barrel of his rifle. I didn't know. Knowing is a luxury you were paid to ignore." Silas roared. He drew his silver-plated revolver, its barrel gleaming in the dim light. He didn't point it at Jack. He pointed it at Elena. "And now you have a choice?" Silas hissed, presenting the moral dilemma that was the true climax of his revenge. "You can kill me. Draw your gun, be the cold-blooded murderer you've always been, and watch her die anyway, because my men are waiting outside. Or you can let me go. Let me walk out of here and live with the knowledge of what you've done, haunted by the ghost of the man you could have been, and the woman you couldn't save. What will it be, hero?" The wind shrieked, and a section of the roof overhead splintered, sending a cascade of dust and debris raining down. Jack looked at Elena's terrified face, at Silas's eyes, mad with grief and vengeance. To kill him would be to validate Silas's entire worldview, that Jack was nothing more than a killer. To hesitate would be to lose everything. He had to choose a third way. "You're right, Silas," Jack said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside and out. "I was a pawn. I took your brother's life without knowing the truth. And for that, I am truly sorry." He dropped his Winchester. It clattered to the floor. Silas watched him, momentarily confused by the surrender. In that split second of hesitation, Jack moved. He didn't draw his pistol. He kicked the leg of the heavy oak table beside him, sending it crashing over. Then he dived not toward Silas, but toward the large canvas-draped object in the corner of the room, the Kane family's grand piano. With all his strength, he shoved it. The heavy instrument, its wheels long seized with rust, scraped across the floor and slammed into the load-bearing wall next to where Silas stood. The decaying house, already battered by the storm, couldn't take the shock. The wall groaned, splintered, and then gave way. A huge section of the ceiling and roof collapsed inward, bringing down a tidal wave of timber plaster and dust. Silas cried out, not in pain, but in surprise, as he was thrown off his feet and buried up to his waist in the debris, his gun knocked from his hand. Jack scrambled to Elena, his knife flashing as he cut her bonds. "Go get out of the house," he yelled over the roar of the storm and the creaking of the dying structure. As Elena ran for the door, Jack turned back to the trapped and struggling Silas. He picked up Silas's fallen revolver and walked toward him. Silas looked up, defeated, his face a mask of dust and hatred. "Finish it," he spat. "Be the monster my brother always said you were." Jack looked down at the man who was the living consequence of his sins. He saw the boy on the porch, the grief-crazed avenger, the victim of a great injustice. He saw himself, and he made his choice. He unloaded the revolver, letting the bullets fall to the floor, and tossed the empty gun aside. "No," Jack said, his voice full of a sorrow so profound it silenced the storm. "The killing ends today." The storm subsided as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a world washed clean and eerily silent. Jack emerged from the ruined house, supporting a dust-covered Silas Kane, whose leg was broken beneath the debris. Outside, Sheriff Miller and a small, determined posse were waiting. They had followed Jack at a distance, unwilling to let him face his demons entirely alone. Silas's men, seeing their leader captured and their ambush foiled by the storm's fury, had long since scattered. The ride back to redemption was quiet. Silas, strapped to a horse and grimacing in pain, spoke only once. As they passed the simple wooden marker of his brother's grave, he looked at Jack, his eyes no longer burning with hate, but hollowed out by a grief that had consumed him. "You should have killed me," he whispered. "Maybe," Jack replied, "but that's what you wanted. I'm not your executioner anymore." Back in town, Jack didn't retreat to the shadows. He walked into the center of the square where the townsfolk had gathered, and he did the hardest thing he had ever done. He told them the truth. He told them about his life as a hired gun, about his work for Josiah Blackwood, and about the real reason Daniel Kane had died. He confessed his role in the Kane family's ruin, holding nothing back. He stood before them, not as the hero who had saved the schoolteacher, but as a flawed man seeking to atone for the sins of his past. The reaction was mixed. Some looked at him with anger and betrayal. The families who had been squeezed by Blackwood decades ago now understood the part Jack had played. But others saw something else. They saw a man taking responsibility, a man choosing accountability over violence. Sheriff Miller stood beside him, a silent show of support. And Elena, her face smudged with dirt, but her eyes clear and steady, placed her hand on his arm, anchoring him in the present. The stolen land deeds couldn't be returned from Ash, but by confessing, Jack returned the truth to the town. He had not won a gunfight. He had surrendered to his own conscience, and in doing so had begun the slow, painful process of earning his own redemption. Weeks later, a fragile peace settled over redemption. Silas Kane had been sent east to face federal trial, not just for robbery, but for the crimes his gang had committed across the territories. The town, armed with Jack's testimony, began the legal process of challenging the old land claims made by Josiah Blackwood's long-defunct company, a fight for their future born from a reckoning with their past. The final scene of the drama unfolded on a quiet, sun-drenched afternoon. Jack stood in the town's small, windswept cemetery, not at Sarah's grave, but at an unmarked plot of earth where Daniel Kane had been buried. He had spent the last week carving a simple wooden marker. It read, "Daniel Kane, a man who fought for his home." With his bare hands, he worked the marker into the hard, dry soil. It was a small gesture against a decade of injustice, but it was a start. It was an act of peace, a quiet apology to a ghost he could finally see clearly. He heard soft footsteps behind him and turned to see Elena. She walked to his side, her presence a comforting warmth. She held something out to him in her palm. It was the silver locket. "Sheriff Miller found it on Silas before they took him away," she explained. "He thought you should have it back." Jack took the locket, its familiar weight settling in his hand. For months it had been a symbol of all he had lost, a shrine to his grief. Now it felt different. He used his thumbnail to work the faulty clasp, and the locket sprang open. He looked at the tiny, smiling portrait of Sarah, and his heart ached not with the sharp pain of loss, but with a gentle, bittersweet love. He did not close it. Instead, he reached down and plucked a small, resilient purple wildflower growing by the grave. He carefully placed the tiny blossom inside the locket next to Sarah's picture, a symbol of new life beside the memory of the old. Then he gently clicked it shut. Elena smiled, a genuine, hopeful smile that reached her eyes. "There's something else," she said, reaching into her satchel. "The final surprise." She pulled out a small, oilskin-wrapped bundle. "When I was cleaning the schoolhouse after everything, I found a loose floorboard. My predecessor must have hidden these. I think he was afraid of what would happen if Blackwood found them." She carefully unwrapped the bundle. Inside was a stack of letters, their ink faded but legible. They were written in Daniel Kane's hand. They were the proof. The letters detailed Blackwood's entire scheme, naming the corrupt officials and outlining his plan to steal the valley's water. Daniel hadn't just been preparing to expose him. He had been writing to a federal marshal. "With these," Elena said softly, "the town can officially restore your family's name. They prove he wasn't a criminal, and they prove you were deceived. You're not just forgiven, Jack. You're cleared." Jack looked from the letters to Elena's face, a wave of profound, cleansing relief washing over him. The weight he had carried for a decade finally lifted. He was no longer a man defined by a single bloody moment in his past. He took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. Together, they stood in the quiet cemetery, the afternoon sun warm on their faces, and looked out over the valley. The town of redemption, once a refuge for his guilt, now stretched before them a place of possibility. They were no longer defined by the ghosts of their pasts, but by the future they would build together, a future earned not with bullets, but with truth, courage, and the hard-won peace of genuine redemption.